The Holy Gospel according to St. Matthew, the 5th chapter. Jesus said, "You are the salt of the earth. But if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything, but is thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hid. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under the bushel basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
Please be seated. Without a doubt, there are certain things in life that are indispensable, aren't there? That is to say, they are absolutely essential. Or another way of putting it is that we can't function without them, right? And so, for example, we can't survive without food, or water, or oxygen, can't forget that one, or shelter, or a handful of other essential items, things that are therefore indispensable. And then there's another level of indispensable things in life, such as your health, your family, friends, your sense of meaning or purpose, and of course, love. In fact, the Apostle Paul, both the Apostle Paul and Yankee baseball great Yogi Berra agreed that love is the most important thing in life, the most indispensable. As St. Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 13, "And now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, and the greatest of these is love." To which Yogi added, "Love is the most important thing in the world, but baseball's pretty good too." Speaking of what's also indispensable, I was struck by this quote that I came across from George Washington's farewell address. "Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity," he wrote, "religion and morality are indispensable supports." Religion and morality are indispensable supports of political prosperity. Which automatically leads one to wonder, of course, if our current political divisions and dysfunction are due then to a lack of these religious and moral supports. Just a thought. And then there's those things that we believed were indispensable, at the time at least, and that we couldn't do without, only to later discover that they actually weren't. Things that we just took for granted and assumed were necessary in life. As an article I read described them, they did not disappear overnight. They simply gradually went away, and more than likely, we didn't even miss them or even think about them. Technology, innovation, and invention did away with them. No longer do we need a telephone book, a telephone booth, a wristwatch, a wall clock, a clock radio, a convection oven, a toaster oven, a tape player, a CD player, a clothesline, a party line, a landline, an answering machine, a disposable camera, film, a video camera, a projector, a pager, a calculator, a fax machine, an antenna, a Rolodex, carbon copy paper, an 8-inch floppy disk, a 5 1/4 inch floppy disk, a 3 1/2 inch floppy disk, a movie rental store, a dial-up modem, a typewriter, a VCR, a road map, a boombox, a desktop computer, a dot matrix printer, and the list goes just on and on pretty much indefinitely. I think you get the picture though. These are things that are completely gone from our lives, and what's more, they're not coming back either. And then there's other things, however, that will always be indispensable, regardless of technologies, inventions, or innovations. Nothing will take the place of them. And two such things are singled out for us in today's gospel reading: salt and light. Just as it was in ancient times, even in our own day, we cannot live without them. But what's interesting, of course, fascinating really, is that Jesus then takes these two indispensable things in life, things that even today we can't do without, and then compares his followers to them. As we heard, "You are the salt of the earth," he said. "You are the light of the world." Now, our gospel reading this morning comes from that section of Matthew's gospel popularly known as the Sermon on the Mount, mostly because it begins in verse 1 of chapter 5 with Jesus going up a mountain followed by his disciples, where he then sat down and began to teach them. And what he shared with them was a rather in-depth discussion of exactly what it meant to be his disciples, exactly what was involved in following him, exactly what would be expected and even at times demanded of them. Francis Chan, the evangelical teacher and preacher, has observed, you go to church these days and sing a couple of songs and listen to the message and go home. I feel very concerned, he says, for those people who walk into these buildings we call church and think that they are Christians because they said a prayer. Saying a prayer means nothing if there's no follow-through. Again, what Jesus is talking about in his Sermon on the Mount is what? Follow-through. Making good on those prayers and accompanying promises. It's about making a commitment, putting forth the effort, and striving to live as best we can, as Jesus has called us to live. Now, David Platt makes a helpful distinction of his own here. The gospel that saves us from work, he says, saves us to work. In other words, our commitments and efforts and strivings are not and were never intended to be what makes things right for us with God. Forgiveness is only the result of God's grace and nothing else. Grace, again, meaning that we do get what we don't deserve, as I like to remind our catechism students. But once we are forgiven, now what? Well, we are now free to follow Jesus and to make commitments and to put forth those efforts that are an outgrowth or a result of being forgiven or set free in this way. Living as Christ has called us to live and following the path where he has led the way and adopting the lifestyle that he himself embodied. Now that's what Christian discipleship is all about. And so, for example, last week we learned from the prophet Micah what's required of us. It's simple, really, to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with our God. Well, if last week answered for us the question, what is required, then this week's reading from the Sermon on the Mount, and in Jesus' own words, mind you, answers the question, what are we to be? And as we heard, Jesus gets straight to the point. You are the salt of the earth, he says. Now, salt is a pretty versatile and useful substance, isn't it? Essential, even. And it's also normally in pretty high demand this time of year because of all the snow and ice that we typically get due to its melting properties, of course, although not so much this year, though, right? And then it's also used to enhance the flavor of our favorite foods as well. After all, what would corn on the cob be like without salt? Or 100 other foods and dishes. It also acts as a preservative. Here's a bit of trivia. Do you remember that passage about Jesus calling those fishermen, Peter and Andrew and James and John, to leave their nets and follow him and become fishers of people instead? Well, it turns out that the Greek word for fisherman doesn't come from the word fish, after all, as you might think. Instead, it comes from the word for salt, referring to the sea. And so then it designates those who made their living on the sea, like sailors, or of course, fishermen. But even more than that, and this is one of the key connections for us this morning, salt was what those ancient fishermen then used to preserve their catch in order to keep it from spoiling. And so as they were retrieving and mending their nets that morning when Jesus came along, they were probably also in the process of salting the fish that they had caught the night before, which then makes Jesus' use of the word salt particularly meaningful and appropriate here in today's reading, especially for those 4 fishermen. In other words, they were well acquainted with the preserving qualities of salt. Now, salt is used for healing as well. 2,000 years ago, when there wasn't a drugstore or pharmacy on every corner, if a soldier was hurt in battle, or a farmer was gored by a bull, or a child fell down and scraped her knee, there was the common treatment. The wound was bathed in salt and water. And of course, it's still used this way today. For instance, how many of you have treated a sore throat by gargling with salt water? This past year, I went to the dentist because of some sensitivity I was feeling in my mouth, and it turns out that I had several cavities. Anyway, after they took x-rays of my mouth and then filled those cavities, I then returned to the dentist on a subsequent appointment and spent what seemed like an eternity with the dental hygienist, who in effect proceeded to power wash my teeth and simultaneously poke and prod and clean and scrape around my teeth and gums with that sharp, pointy tool they use. And then after she polished my teeth, she said that my mouth and gums might feel a little sore for the rest of the day. Do you think? Talk about an understatement. But she said you might want to gargle with some warm salt water to make you feel better. Again, salt promotes healing. How valuable is salt? It's reported that over 40 million tons of it are required each year to fill our needs. Homer called it divine, Plato called it a substance close to the gods, and Shakespeare mentions it no fewer than 17 times in his plays. In all, we found over 14,000 uses for salt, in everything from adhesives to batteries, even to explosives. In ancient Greece, their far-flung trade involving the exchange of salt for slaves gave rise to the expression, not worth his salt. And Roman soldiers were in part paid a sum which was then used by them to buy salt, which again was a valuable and versatile commodity. In fact, that's where the English word salary comes from. It's also said that thousands of Napoleon's troops died during his bitter retreat from Moscow. Died because their bodies would not heal, and the reason why they would not heal is because their bodies lacked enough salt. In fact, the human body contains roughly about 7 ounces of salt, or a little less than half a pound, but without enough of it, muscles won't contract, blood won't circulate, food won't digest, and the heart won't pump. As Terry Laughlin observes, salt preserves. It keeps things from going bad and decaying, it cleanses and disinfects. Salt penetrates, spreads all about in flavors, it inserts a new quality. It can take bland, tasteless food and make it enjoyable. A sprinkle of salt has a widespread effect. It changes that which it is put upon. But as Laughlin also observes, too many Christians overlook their purpose in God's ministry to people in the world. Too much salt is being stored up in the church building, he says, and not gotten out into the world. And therefore our Lord gives a solemn warning. If Christians lose their penetrating and preserving effectiveness, they will become worthless. As Jesus pointed out, if salt loses its taste, that is, if it loses its ability to preserve, cleanse, heal, and especially to flavor, then it's no longer good for anything, he said. And so again, what is the very first thing that Jesus says to his disciples to describe them? You are the salt of the earth. In other words, you are the essence of life. You provide and inject a much-needed ingredient into the life of the world. That is, according to Jesus, you are to give flavor to life by being an example to others of what an abundant life in me is all about. And you're to preserve life by teaching them the difference between good and bad and right and wrong. Furthermore, you're to bring healing by reaching out to love and care for a hurting world. In fact, you are to melt away the cold-heartedness of those who would ignore the suffering of others and who care only about themselves. And notice that he doesn't say here, you will become salt, or someday you might exhibit the very same properties as salt, or if you work hard enough and do as I say, you can eventually be the salt of the earth. No, he says, you are the salt of the earth already, by virtue merely of being my disciples, not soon, not someday, not eventually, but now, right this minute, you are the salt of the earth. A woman once wrote to the editor of Christianity Today, to share the following story. One afternoon, my 4-year-old niece Paige and my 6-year-old daughter Ashley started an argument, which grew louder and louder. And I was about to intervene when my daughter stormed down the stairs. Mom, she said, Jesus wants us to be the salt of the earth, and Paige is being the pepper. Oh, there's also one more property of salt. At a meeting, some church youth once were discussing Jesus' expression of salt of the earth, and they went around the room suggesting all the various uses for salt. Salt gives flavor to food, it preserves food to keep it from spoiling, and so forth. And then one girl said, salt makes you thirsty. And at that moment, they all got quiet, apparently thinking to themselves, have I ever made anyone thirsty for Jesus? You are the salt of the earth, he said. Jesus also said, you are the light of the world. Now, light, of course, is what helps us to see, especially when it's dark. It illuminates our way. Without it, we'd keep bumping into things, wouldn't we? And so the implication here is pretty obvious then. You are the light of the world means that Jesus' disciples exist to help others simply to see. A pastor by the name of Jerry Fleury once wrote, as I was driving this past week, I was noticing how beautiful the path of lights along the highway looked against the darkness of the pre-dawn sky. The lights lighting the roadway sparkled like diamonds against a canvas of ebony. The scene caused me to think about the beauty of the night. And as I gazed upon the scene, I began to see that the darkness really had no beauty of its own. It struck me that what causes a night scene to be beautiful is not the darkness of the night, it's the piercing of the darkness by objects or reflections of light. Light punching holes in the darkness, he wrote. As believers, he says, we are called to be hole punchers. We are called to pierce the darkness of the night with the good news of Jesus Christ, the light of the world. Earlier, I recalled the words of Washington's farewell address, namely that religion and morality are the indispensable supports of political prosperity. Maybe, as American Christians, especially at this time in our history, it is our role, our responsibility even, to be hole punchers who pierce the darkness of our current political division and dysfunction with the light of Jesus Christ. In addition, Jesus adds a subtle but important reminder here. Let your light shine before others, he says, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. In other words, it's not for your own advancement or advantage or reward. Just like salt, light is nothing all by itself. As Chris Thomas writes, salt and light are only useful when they enhance something else. We, as followers of Jesus, fulfill our roles as disciples, he says, when we flavor the earth and illuminate the world with our actions and words that ultimately point to Christ. You see, it's not about us. It's not about what we can do or what we can achieve. Because if it's just about us, then we've completely missed the point. No, it's about Jesus. We serve as the salt of the earth and shine as the light of the world, not for our own sake, but for the sake of others. Someone once asked the Greek philosopher and politician Alexander Papadopoulos, what is the meaning of life? And taking his wallet out of his hip pocket, he fished into this leather billfold and brought out a very small round mirror, about the size of a quarter. When I was a small child, he said, during the Second World War, we were very poor and lived in a remote village. And one day on the road, I found the broken pieces of a mirror. A German motorcycle had been wrecked in that place. And I tried to find all the pieces and put them together, but it was not possible. So I kept only the largest piece, this one. And by scratching it on a stone, I made it round. And I began to play with it as a toy, and I became fascinated by the fact that I could reflect light into dark places where the sun would never shine, in deep holes, in crevices, in dark closets. It became a game for me to get light into the most inaccessible places I could find. I kept that little mirror, and as I became a man, I grew to understand that this was not just a child's game, but a metaphor for what I might do with my life. I came to understand that I am not the light or the source of light, but light, truth, understanding, knowledge will only shine in many dark places if I reflect it. I am a fragment of a mirror whose whole design and shape I do not know. Nevertheless, with what I have, I can reflect light into the dark places of this world, into the black places in the hearts of men, and change some things in some people. This is what I'm about. This is the meaning of my life. Is there any better way in which to describe what Jesus is talking about here this morning? Let your light shine before others, said Jesus, so that they may see your good works, but give glory to your Father in heaven. You see, that's what it means to be the light of the world, said Jesus, to live lives and to perform deeds that indeed make a difference, to live lives and perform deeds that glorify our Father in heaven. You are, said Jesus, salt and light. That's what it means to be my disciple. It's not what we want to be or aspire to be. It's not who we might become. It's who we already are. You are salt and light. You are indispensable, just as they are, said Jesus. Now all we have to do is claim this identity. It's already ours. We are salt and light. We are indispensable. And so now we are to go out and live out that identity each and every day through the lives we touch and the light we share.